If you have a good eye, you saw this engine in pretty much this exact state in the background of a couple of shots in the last video. That was more or less on purpose. The blur effect is a paid feature in my video editor, and let's be honest, we're not exactly shelling out the big bucks for this project. When we got this engine, it was a little tired, it needed a lot of work, and so a couple of videos ago, we tore it down to the block, gave everything a good once over, and now I'll show you how it went back together. So this is the bottom of the engine block. We're going to build the engine mostly from the bottom up. Here we're preparing the surfaces that the crankshaft bearings sit on. We just want everything to be as clean as possible. Later I noticed a lot of paint flecks all over the engine block and I took a lot less care in cleaning, but this interface is pretty important. The bearings sit in these little half circle indents on the block. Basically, these just provide a surface for oil to run between the crankshaft and the bearing to give it like a film of oil to rotate around. Each of these kind of clips into position and there's a little tang that holds it in place. If you're ever rebuilding an engine, hopefully the person who machined it before you marked like what they were machined to. Otherwise, you have to measure these bores. I was lucky enough to see both the part numbers and labels on the block of what it was machined out to, and I was able to buy the right parts online. We just want to make sure these are fully seated because, again, they do kind of clip in, and the clearances for this part are really important. So once all the bearings are in, we lay the crank down on top. We're actually doing a dry fitting of this. I'll explain that in a minute. That's why we're not putting any assembly lube on just yet. Once we put the crank in, we're going to use this product called Plastigauge to measure the tolerances in between the bearings, the bearing caps, and the crankshaft. Basically, it's this little thin rod of plastic that you put on top of all of the mating surfaces. And when you clamp everything together, that will deform and we can get an accurate measurement of the tolerances between the parts. So once we have a piece of Plastigauge in place on top of each of the mating surfaces, we can put our top bearings into the caps and put the caps on, and then we're going to torque everything down to spec, and then undo everything and see what the measurements look like. There's a decent amount of tapping with the hammer and general frustration, especially because we don't want to move around the Plastigauge. We only want it to deform under our bolt torque and not from us whacking it with a hammer. But this is a good learning process, and I'm kind of glad we're doing a dry fit so we make sure we get it right when it actually matters. So real quick, we'll torque everything down. And then we'll pull everything off. Again, more frustration, maybe some more hammering. We got to get the bearing cap separated, and we don't want to move around that Plastigauge. And then once it's off, you can see that the Plastigauge is smooshed down. The packaging of the Plastigauge has a little gauge that you hold up next to it, and you just say, yeah, that looks like about 3.5 mils. Good enough for me. To be honest, rewatching this footage, I'm not sure I remember what the gauge was supposed to read. I think you want it to be like right in the middle or maybe a little bit on the tight side and definitely not out of whack with the high or low end of the gauge. We're right in the middle in either the 0.015, 0.0015 and 0.002. This is kind of one of those black magic things of engine rebuilding where I kind of feel like if you're not building a high performance engine, it doesn't really matter. I mostly did this for the learning experience and just to make sure that we didn't have to do a lot of remachining of the block or the crank to make everything nice. This is probably good enough for me and for a truck. We're not doing drag races here. So once we verify that everything looks good, it's time to put it all back together, this time with ample amounts of assembly lubricant. This is another one of those black magic arguments on the internet of what kind of lubricant is the best to use. I bought the one that looked cool. I liked the red, white, and blue, and more importantly, it was on Amazon Prime, so it came the next day, and it was $5 cheaper than at AutoZone. Again, really making high performance decisions in this build. Luckily, we practiced this, so we know how to kind of drop the crankshaft in. We know how to get the bearing caps on it without too much frustration from the hammer. And we know how to torque everything down. I don't know if you guys like these bolt torque edits, but get used to it because we're doing a lot of bolt torquing in this video. I'm positive somebody makes a tool to turn an engine over while you're rebuilding it, but by the end of this video, I will have destroyed this pipe wrench by using it in very inappropriate ways on some very sharp surfaces. This is the camshaft. If you remember from previous videos, this is what moves the valves up and down. Basically, each one of these lobes corresponds to a valve in the engine that, when this is timed properly with the crankshaft, sets your mechanical timing of the whole engine. The push rods ride on top of these lobes and move up and down as the shaft rotates around. And yeah, that's what good macaroni and cheese sounds like. If you know, you know. So sliding this in, you can see the big silvery circular parts of the camshaft. Those actually sit inside of precision holes in the bore, and so you want to make sure that those are nicely aligned up before you just jam the thing in. It's pretty easy in the beginning, but eventually the weight of the camshaft makes it really hard to angle it up to kind of slide correctly into its bore. I end up kind of forcing it in. There are fillets on the ends that help you, but you can see at the end it gets a little stuck. And if you just go grab your cam pulley, this sits on a little pin, and you can use that to kind of give you a little extra leverage instead of just gripping that little rod. And there you go, that cam is fully seated, I hope. So this timing pulley is a bit of a puzzle to get on. There's 3 bolts that go into the camshaft, and then there's a 4th hole that's a pin that aligns it. And then each of these gears is marked with a dot, and you want those dots to line up. That's what sets kind of the 0 position of the crank and the cam relative to each other. And this is the first time I've ever done this, and I think we got it right. But it is a little stressful of like, is this perfectly aligned? Again, we're not building this from scratch with all new parts, so I can kind of trust that most of these just go back together the way that they came out. This is a very important thing to get right though, or I think we'll never be able to time the engine correctly and it'll never run right, or worse, blow itself up. But everything spins freely and the bolts go in and nothing bound up, so I'm calling that good. Everything looks like it's working like it's supposed to be. I did not capture footage of me torquing these 3 bolts down, and not that I think you guys are really interested in watching me bolt things down, but when I was editing this video, I had a panic attack because I had already finished building the engine, and if I didn't torque those down, they were definitely going to come loose and blow themselves up. And so I ended up tearing the engine back apart after it was in the truck to make sure that they were torqued down, and what do you know? They were torqued down. I just didn't record it. Well, not actually. Before we rebuild the pistons, we're going to go down our next major side quest that no one on the internet can agree on, setting our piston ring gap. I bought these piston ring pliers at a swap meet right before I filmed this, which is incredibly convenient. Each piston has 5 rings. They're a split ring that you basically squeeze open, slide over the piston, and then they don't really grip it, but they sit in these grooves. These rings are what seal against the cylinder walls. Without that seal, you can't compress the air-fuel mixture, so your engine just won't work if these aren't set right. That's the theory anyway. If we ignore the pistons for a second, let's just look at how a ring sits in the cylinder. Again, it's a split ring, so they can kind of squeeze in and out, and they seal against the walls of the cylinder. But each one has a little gap in between ends of the ring. Placing the piston ring inside the cylinder, we can measure that gap and see if it meets the specs of whatever random person posted on an internet forum about it. Side note, to get the piston ring measurement accurate, you have to make sure that it's basically perfectly parallel to the top of the block, and I 3D printed this little fixture that shoves it in there and makes it perfectly square, and maybe that'll be my new side hustle, because that thing was a lifesaver and they're like $45 online or 30 cents in plastic. Once the piston ring is square in the cylinder, we can just use a gauge to figure out the distance between the ends of the ring. This is another one of those things that, looking back at this footage, I can't remember what I actually set it to. People are very picky about this, and they're very specific that the other people are wrong. And this doesn't seem like something that actually really matters, so I ended up just kind of making it consistent across all of the cylinders and calling that good enough. I borrowed this piston ring grinder from a friend at work. Make sure you wear your safety glasses. Basically, this has a dial gauge, and you kind of spin the piston ring against this sanding block. And you can apparently accurately trim the ends of the piston rings. I didn't find this very accurate at all, but it was kind of fun. Once we've grinded everything and they're nicely parallel to each other, there is a little burr. So I took that off with a file. It's kind of funny, we're grinding these to be like a precision gap between them, but if we mess up and leave this burr on, it's going to scratch the crap out of our cylinder walls, and that's going to lead to leaky compression anyway. So I kind of felt like, after I spent 2 weekends doing this, that it was a huge waste of time and didn't actually add to my performance and potentially took away from my reliability. But you live and learn, I guess. So that was one live, and we have to trim 2 of them per cylinder, so we'll just watch a time lapse of the other 15 that we have to do. Luckily, 3 of the rings on each piston don't need to be filed. Also incredibly boring is watching me put all of these piston rings on, but man, thank God for those pliers. Best $1 I've ever spent. Okay, so we have to set our piston ring gap placement. Basically, if each of these are aligned, gases can escape during the power stroke, which makes you lose power. So you want these to all be offset. There's a diagram in the manual that tells you exactly where to place them. So this is our datum pointing to the front of the engine, so we'll call that 12 o'clock. We're going to set the placement of all 5 of these rings just to follow the manual. So the first one we're going to do is the oil expander ring. So that's this big one. We're going to put this at 3 o'clock. So you can see that this is the gap between the 2 ends of the ring. Slide that over to 3 o'clock. Good enough. Then on top of each of these is an oil rail, I think it's called. It basically holds that one in place. So we're going to try to move these without sliding the one in the middle. And we're gonna put these at like 7 o'clock and 10 o'clock. Basically just not at 90 degrees. We've got one there, and the other one, put a little more. Good enough. So then for our second rail, these are a lot easier to move. Second ring end gap is going to be 9 o'clock, and the first ring is going to be 3 o'clock. So basically these rings seal the piston against the bore of the cylinder. Just don't want them to be aligned so gases can't escape past them. So we have these 2 nicely offset, and then we have these far enough away from the expander, I guess, and then they're only like 90 degrees from each other. Let's move this one a little bit. Pretty sure these move over the life of the engine. You just want to get them right the first time, and I don't know. I guess every time you rebuild the engine, they're in a random spot. It's good enough for me. So with our piston rings gapped and clocked correctly, we're ready to install them in the engine. To do that, we're going to employ an AutoZone loaner tool. I really didn't want to buy one for myself since I hope I never have to do this again. Basically, this is just a clamp that holds the piston rings compressed so that you can easily slide the whole thing into the engine. You pop this tool back off, and then the piston rings seat against the cylinder walls. This just helps you slide it in. So we already installed our bearings onto the connecting rod, so we just have to lubricate everything up and slide it in. The orientation of this matters like a lot. They'll bind up if you put them in the wrong way. There's a chamfer on one side that you want to line up against the crankshaft. And then there's a side that kind of touches its adjacent connecting rod. Once you get it clocked at, roughly the right angle and facing the right way, you can pound it in. I'm using a mallet and a piece of wood. I just don't want to mar the top of the piston, but more importantly, you don't want to scratch up the cylinder wall or the crank by accidentally running the con rod, the reds, up against a smooth surface. If you hear that clicking, that's it touching something it's not supposed to be, and I'm just kind of guiding it with my hand. To really drive it home, we're going to flip the engine over. That allows us to see the bottom of the connecting rod because it's like a close bore that's going to mate up against each other, and we want to make sure that we drive it in straight and, again, not mess up any of those surfaces. So a couple of taps of it when it's upside down, you can see that connecting rod moving up, and it's eventually just going to cup the bottom of the crankshaft. This is another part where the clearances really matter. We didn't measure them. I think it's just going to be okay. Once the piston and connecting rod are kind of in the right spot, or at least seated up against the crank, we can install our bearings onto our, I don't know what this thing is called, the connecting rod cap? Yeah, a rod cap. Yeah, that sounds right. We lubricate that, we rotate the crank so we have easy access to it, line it up with the bolts. Each rod cap has 2 nuts that go on it, and you just want to kind of get this thing on straight. Again, it's a pretty tight cup, and so we want to make sure that we're not accidentally pinching the bearing up against the crankshaft, and we want to make sure that it's fully seated, obviously, before we torque anything down. If you remember, getting these off was a huge pain in the butt, and getting them on is not much easier. Once it's installed, give it a couple rotations to make sure that nothing's binding up and it feels okay, and that's about all I know how to do to make sure that it was installed correctly. Turning the engine gets harder and harder with each piston that you put in because there's slightly more friction from the piston rings. So after the first one, you do get pretty good at it and you get into a rhythm, and it's kind of therapeutic to be putting the pistons in. Just don't think about if you forget to torque something or if something is pinched, that the engine will probably tear itself apart. We're not going to worry about that. And once all the pistons are in, it's starting to look like an engine, so I think that's pretty exciting. So, do you need a bearing press to reassemble an engine? No. And clearly I'm getting a lot of mileage out of this block of wood. Here we're pressing the timing cover seal onto the timing cover. Basically this whole orange cover is called the timing cover. It has a little tab on it that you can use to time the engine against the harmonic balancer. I showed that in a previous video, and I'll show that in the next video when we time this engine. The seal, anyway, is the thing that seals the tip of the crankshaft, basically the front of the engine. This is the, second most common place for leaks, so you want to make sure you get this seal in straight and that it seals really well against the bottom of the crankshaft. And yeah, a piece of wood will do just fine. So admittedly, installing the timing cover is not the most interesting thing to watch, and I don't really have anything to teach you in this clip. But I did strip 2 bolts, and by strip I mean I broke the heads clean off them. So this is your lesson. Buy high quality bolts and torque them properly. Learn from my mistake. I'm lucky that these 2 came out relatively easily, especially after our movie magic took 45 minutes of swearing down to 10 seconds of bolts popping out. I did not have the same luck on the oil pan, same exact bolt, broke the head clean off. Also broke 3 extractor bits and then widened the hole so much that I couldn't really do anything else with it. If you look at that middle hole, it's just gonna live there now. We'll try our best to seal it with RTV and hope it doesn't leak. Probably should have rethreaded it at the next size up, but we didn't. Okay, so while I had this thing open, I figured we might as well replace the valve seals. And while we have it open, I might as well explain to you what valves do. These are the heads. Each one of these is a valve. And if we flip this over, you can see that's the bottom of the valve. So that's what opens up to let intake air and gas in and exhaust gases out into the top of the piston. So I already removed one of the valves. This is the valve itself. I don't know, these are made of some kind of exotic metal, and these move up and down to let in and out gases, like a little door. The camshaft is what actually pushes them up and down, and it pushes them up against this spring. So as the valve moves up, it compresses the spring, which forces it back down. So how are all these retained? These slide through this little shaft in the engine, and then there's a little O-ring that wipes along the inside of this cylinder. And this whole thing is held together at the top by these little locks. It's basically these guys. Those squeeze around like that to hold it in the top of this flared shaft. And to compress the valves, we use this very scary looking device that I got from a coworker. I tried the ones that you can get out AutoZone, tried 2 different ones and they didn't work. This one makes it compress. Terrifying. And what we're actually replacing are these O-rings, just to give us a little extra seal. If any oil slips past these valves, it burns in the cylinder, and that's what makes everything black. So all these are rubber O-rings that prevent oil from dripping down the shaft and falling right underneath the valve. If you read around on the internet, people recommend umbrella type, which kind of look like one of those collars you give your dog after it gets surgery so it doesn't lick itself. That prevents more oil from dripping down. This is like the rain gutter versus the O-rings are just like the little lip on the edge of a roof. But then some people on the web forums say that the umbrella ones don't let enough oil down the shaft, and that can be bad for your valves. So what was the tiebreaker? We went with the ones that came in our rebuild kit, so we didn't have to buy umbrella ones. So this video does not do this tool justice. It's legitimately terrifying to use, and these valve springs are no joke. Once they're loose, you can't compress them by hand. I think these are probably like 50 or 60 pound springs. And so when all of that is compressed, if the tool lets go, that goes flying off, and it's just terrifying to use. Even worse, when you get the tool compressed around the spring, the little locking pins can sometimes be a little frozen, and so you have to whack on them with a hammer, like a real hammer, and that just kind of pops them loose, then you can grab them with a magnet. But the whole ordeal of smacking a compressed spring that could probably do a lot of damage if it lets loose is pretty terrifying, and we only had to do it 16 times. Once you get the retaining clips out, you can just gently release the pressure from the air tool, and then everything comes out really neatly. On top there's a retaining ring, the spring, and then a washer, and then the valve can just slide right out the bottom. Most of these valves were really dirty on the bottom. This is carbon buildup, maybe because it doesn't have umbrella seals on it. And believe it or not, the internet doesn't think that this carbon buildup really matters, but we checked them up in the drill and cleaned it off with a wire brush, and that made us feel a little better to put a clean part back together. The real scary part is you have to compress the spring without those retaining clips in, so like the only thing holding this from flying apart is that air cylinder. And then you have to finagle the seal on. while looking basically directly down the shaft. Pretty scary. Once the seal's in place, you can put those retaining clips back on, and then for the scariest moment, you have to release the pressure, and it kind of grabs onto those clips, and there you go. You've replaced a valve seal. 15 more to go. Just like the pistons, you find your groove and you get pretty good at it, and it's a lot less scary once you've done it 16 times. And I'm glad we don't have to do this leaned over the inside of the engine bay, because that would be a lot more painful. This clip has no natural segue, but every clip I show you after this will have the oil pump installed, so for continuity's sake, here's us installing that. The long shaft that we inserted before we screwed it down actually connects up to the distributor, and then the distributor picks up the gears on the camshaft, and so the oil pump and the distributor both spin together, timed off of the camshaft, which is kind of neat. Again, all mechanical design, pretty neat. Another continuity catch, this is the harmonic balancer. It's a big weight that you mount onto the crankshaft, and that helps dampen out any of the vibrations from the engine spinning. This is pressed onto the crankshaft, and it's actually what seals against that seal in the timing cover. And if you're out there looking for loaner tools, I much prefer the Advanced Auto Parts Harmonic Balancer Installer Puller over the AutoZone one. So, yeah. One trick I learned way too late in this engine build is how much easier it is to install stuff when the threads are clean. They sell engine thread cleaning kits that basically have all the right taps and cleaners for an engine rebuild, or you can do what I did and buy the taps one at a time, driving to the auto parts store every time you had to clean a new thread size. While I was cleaning the engine, I found this like calcified mineral deposit basically in all of the cooling channels, and I found that when you flip the engine over, because you can hear all those little boogers coming out of the engine. It's like kidney stones. Since we're going to put the heads on, it's easier to clean out those cooling passages now, and so we did our best. We also used the vacuum and tried to cover up as many of the ports as we could to suck the kidney stones out of the other ports. That worked okay, but as you can see, it sounds a lot better, and it's probably good enough because the rest of the cooling system isn't any better. Side note, do you remember when some jackass spilled 10 gallons of fuel in my garage? Well, at one point I realized I still had a little left in this metal bucket and have been using it to clean small parts. It doesn't matter how gunky they are, a few minutes in here and everything scrubs right off, including paint. Basically every bolt and small bracket in the engine took a trip through it, including this dipstick neck, which went in completely black. I'm honestly glad I only have a little bit left, because I worry I'd try to bathe in it, or at least wash my hands. It's probably good. So we get everything as clean as we can, put the head gasket on, and then we can mount the heads. If you remember, I wanted to do this with the crane before, didn't do it then, and didn't do it now. Since the head bolts are all, or most, or at least two of them directly connected into the cooling channels, you're either supposed to oil the bolts, or like I'm doing here, put a little bit of thread sealant on the tips. I did all of them because I figured it couldn't hurt, and I really don't want to leak water into my oil passages. This stuff is basically just Teflon tape, but in liquid form, and it's kind of satisfying to put on. The torque order matters, and it's honestly kind of hard to keep track of the front and rear of the engine, so the heads are symmetric. I just drew out the bolt pattern and had it for easy reference. And with both heads mounted up and snug down, it's ready for your favorite part of the video. With the heads on, it's time to rebuild the top end. Superfans will remember that I said I was going to build a 3D printed container to hold the lifters, and I did. It failed halfway through, but it does its job of holding the lifters. These transfer motion from the camshaft to the push rods. Those aren't directly connected like I've been acting this whole time. These are kind of just a bearing that has a flat face that touches the camshaft, and then a little detent that the rocker sits in. They slide into these grooves. They're pretty satisfying to put in. I put a lot of lubricant on them. That's about all I have to say. The order of these is pretty important for a used engine. You want to make sure you're matching all of your wear patterns by putting the same parts back into the slots they came out of. I am 60% sure I got them in the right location, and if I got it wrong, it is 100% wrong, because the only thing I probably could have messed up is the front to back. Again, pretty sure I got it right. Unfortunately, the top of my 3D print is where the labels were, so pretty sure I got it right. My pushrod and rocker organization was decidedly lower tech, but I got the labels right this time. So we install the pushrod into its little detent on the lifter, and then we put the rocker on top of its stud on the head. The rocker is called that because it rocks in between the valve spring and the pushrod as they each move up and down, and that's what transfers motion going up into motion going down. This is as low tech as it comes. This is like how engines were built since the beginning of time. Chevy still uses them, and it's kind of endearing. It's also why modern Corvette engines are so low compared to other cars, because this allows for a very compact, flat engine as opposed to an overhead cam, which makes the engine taller. Mid-engine Corvettes use overhead cams now because they don't need low hoods, because there's nothing in the front. So these run against the camshaft, which is underneath here. They push up, which compresses the valve, and this spring returns it. These springs here return the valve back to position after this rotates around. So right now I have the cylinder number 1, top dead center. Sorry, I have cylinder number 1 with the exhaust valve just barely opening, which means that this is nice and loose. We're going to snug this up. Putting down my little decoder ring, so if you're looking at the engine like this, cylinder 13572468. I have the exhaust and the intake valves labeled, and then just in case I forget, the firing order of the engine. So this is another one of those eternal arguments on the internet, how to remove valve lash. Basically, you don't want your valve so loose that it's bouncing up and down. You want it to be either in contact with the spring, which is holding it closed, or the cam, which is holding it open. And if it's bouncing around in between those two extremes, that means that exhaust gas or intake air is leaking around your valve. So the process that I used is, like I described before, I keep the valve loose where it's not on the cam lobe, and then I slowly tighten it as I push it up and down with my other hand. And basically once I detect no more up and down motion, I stop tightening, and then I turn exactly 1/2 a turn after that. I then move the crankshaft to set the next valve into its floating position. And I do the same process, and I have to move my way around the engine, not in order of the push rods, but in order of the cylinders, if that makes sense. Anyway, it's just tedious, and you gotta make sure you're on the right one, or one valve is gonna have lash, and the engine's not gonna run right. One down. So since 2 turns of the camshaft is every cylinder firing, that means that if you remember the cylinder firing order, 18436572, it's burned into the brain of anybody who's worked on one of these engines. You really just have to turn the crank 90 degrees and then move on to the next cylinder in that order. You get the hang of it. Kind of hard to explain. So I just think this view is satisfying. This is after I've tightened all the rockers down, and they kind of just wiggle like a little dance. Some people actually set valve lash with the engine running. I think oil gets everywhere, but it's also a little terrifying that a finger might get stuck or something. And I like this way because that whale sound is the air being forced out of the cylinders. Now the engine is singing us the song of its people. So the fuel pump is, you guessed it, mechanical. There's a little lever on the inside of the fuel pump that's pushed by a push rod that's pushed by something. I assume the camshaft. And we can hold that rod in place with this little screw. We install the fuel pump, and then we can remove that screw, and the push rod should drop against that lever, and then when you start the engine, it pushes and pumps fuel. I think. I guess if it doesn't work, we won't have any fuel flow, and that'll be obvious. So yeah, we're all right. The oil pan seals with 4 seals, which is kind of silly. There's the 2 flat cork ones on either side, and then 2 rubber half circle ones that go over the humps. I RTV'd in between gaskets and over that stripped screw, and I also used RTV to hold the gaskets in place. I figured you can't use too much RTV. I try to make sure the RTV squeezed out enough that I knew it was at least being compressed. But put the oil pan on, tighten it down, try not to strip any screws, and pray it doesn't leak. That's about all we can do. So, where are we at? It's been 3 months, and we have a mostly rebuilt engine. We have a mostly clean engine bay. So we're like 80% done. Unfortunately, the last 20% is going to take 80% of the time because that to-do list is a doozy. We have to install the intake manifold, install the coolant sensor, install the coolant lines, clean the transmission, install the flywheel, the clutch, and the bell housing. We put the engine in the truck. We have to install the water pump, the alternator, the pulleys, the belt. We have to install the carburetor. We have to figure out the air cleaner situation. Old one doesn't fit. New one doesn't have the right adapters. Not sure what we're doing there. We have to install the spark plugs and the wires, install the exhaust, the drive shaft, and the trans tunnel. We have to buy new carpet and sound deadening. We got to clean the floor of the garage. We have to install the fan and the fan shroud, and then install the radiator. That order is very important, apparently. Learned that the hard way. We have to fill the transmission oil, fill the coolant, fill the oil, install the distributor, fix the wires that I think a mouse chewed on, to time the engine, to put the hood back on, and then we can get to the list that we wrote on the whiteboard almost a year ago. I really struggle with finding the right stopping point for these videos because I want to find like something that's real progress to share and make a video of. All I feel like I've done in the last 3 months is clean oily parts. So many oily parts. I wanted to upload 13 videos to YouTube this year because once a month was too obvious, and I wanted to do more than once a month, and we are nowhere near on track to hit that. I think instead of letting the footage pile up until I'm so overwhelmed that I have to crank out a poorly thought out video anyway, I'm just going to try uploading on a more regular cadence and just let everything else work itself out. We'll see how that goes, but I'll see you in 2 weeks. Maybe.